Hello guys, how's it going? Well, as you can probably tell by now, I am definitely a bookworm, and I'm a big fan especially of classic literature. In our last video, we talked about the Bronte sisters, and I went through their 7 main novels, kind of like ranking them from my least favorite to my most favorite. But I thought in this video we would switch gears and actually talk about a totally different genre, which is dystopian fiction. So dystopian novels typically imagine a society where something has gone really wrong, and it's usually because of something like the government or technology which has gained too much power over individual people. And although these books are fictional, they are rarely just about an imaginary future. A lot of times the authors will write these dystopian novels in order to criticize something that they see happening in their own time. And a lot of times it kind of serves as a warning of what things can lead to if things kind of keep going down the same path. Today, I thought we would look at 3 of the most influential dystopian novels in English literature. These books, the 3 that I'm going to talk about, they're going to be a good fit for you if you're between a B2 and a C1 level of English. And for each book, I'll talk specifically about kind of the level recommendation, okay? The books that we'll be going through are 1984 by George Orwell, Brave New World by Aldous Huxley, and Fahrenheit 451 by Ray Bradbury. Now, all 3 of these books imagine societies where individual freedom has been lost, but what I think is so interesting is that they each do this in slightly different ways. So that's what I want to look at today. All right, so the first one is 1984 by George Orwell. This was originally published in 1949. This is actually my Portuguese copy that I got here in Brazil. I have an English copy, but it is somewhere in the States and I don't know where. I have read this book at least 3 times, maybe 4 times. I don't remember exactly, but it's a good one. I've read it a lot. And this story is set in a dystopian future where the entire world has kind of split up into these 3 super states that are in constant war. The protagonist in the story, Winston, is living in one of the super states, which is called Oceania. And Oceania is monitored by the party, that's like the government, and they control every aspect of life, even like the way that you speak, the words you use, even your thoughts. There's something called the thought police in the story, so they really control every single thing that the individuals in this society do. The people in the story are expected to show complete loyalty to Big Brother, which you might have heard of. Of course, we have in Brazil here, we have the really famous reality show Big Brother that actually comes from this book. So a lot of times when you hear people making comments, things like Big Brother's watching or talking about Big Brother, that originally comes from 1984. Now, the party mainly controls people through surveillance and propaganda. And our protagonist, Winston, works at the Ministry of Truth, is what it's called, but it's actually kind of the opposite. And his job is actually to look at public records and change them to fit what like the party's current messaging and current propaganda is. So for example, as I said, the world in this story is split up into 3 kind of super states. And sometimes Oceania is at war with one of the super states and is allied with the other one. But sometimes they'll swap. And so sometimes, oh no, now we're at war with this other super state and we're allied with this other one. So they're always kind of flip-flopping, but whenever the party says that they're at war with one or the other, they don't say that they've like changed their mind or they've switched partners or something like that. They say that it's always been that way. And so Winston's job in the Ministry of Truth is to go back and change historical records to fit with whatever the party is saying right then. And as we follow Winston through the story, he starts to question the society he's living in and the reality that he's told to believe. The novel delves into themes like truth, language, freedom, and unchecked political power. Now, there's some historical and cultural context that can help us to understand what was kind of happening when George Orwell wrote this story originally. But before we get into that, I actually want to talk a little bit more about the author himself. So first of all, George Orwell is actually the author's pen name. His real name was Eric Arthur Blair, and he actually began his life in British colonial India. And a lot of people say that his experience with colonialism really shaped his views on imperialism and on injustice. So he began life in India, but then moved to England as a young child with his mother and siblings. Now, when George Orwell was writing this story, it was actually in kind of a post-World War II atmosphere. And Europe was devastated by the Second World War. So you had cities that were destroyed, you had millions of people that were displaced, and economies were weakened. And because of the war, these new advanced forms of communication were getting developed, and this led to a lot of fear about government surveillance, which we can see reflected in the story. And then the spread of mass media, so things like film, newspapers, radio, this really highlighted how the public could be manipulated, how propaganda could be used on a large scale. Now, remember I said in the beginning of the video that a lot of times dystopian authors are not talking about just an imaginary future. They're actually critiquing their present, right? So the title of this book is 1984. If you flip-flop 84, it becomes 48, right? And the novel was published in 1949. So that would mean he was probably still writing the novel in 1948. So a lot of people will say that he chose this title and like this year to place his, his story, his fictional story. He placed it in 1984, just flipping those last two numbers because he was actually talking about the present. So he was actually kind of critiquing and talking about things that were happening or starting to happen during his time. Now I'm going to read for you one of my favorite quotes from this book. I have highlighted it every single time that I've read it. So the quote is, "If he were allowed contact with foreigners, he would discover that they are creatures similar to himself and that most of what has been told about them is lies. The sealed world in which he lives would be broken, and the fear, hatred, and self-righteousness on which his moral depends might evaporate." So this quote particularly is talking about how in the story, if you remember, I said that in 1984, they're living in this world that's split up into these three super states that are always at war, right? And you have this propaganda going throughout the entire story where they're talking about how these people are the enemies, they're so dangerous, we have to be careful of them, they're so bad, etc. And at this point in the story, when we get to this quote, we see that we're starting to understand that one of the ways that the party maintains power is by keeping people isolated from one another and keeping them fearful of one another. So there's like saying, oh, this other super state is super dangerous. Oh, be careful of them, stay away from them. And they use isolation and fear to keep, to maintain power over the people. And the quote mentions this sealed world where Winston and the other characters in the story are living. So it's sealed off from people from other cultures, people from other places, etc. And so the idea is that if the people from Oceania, Winston and the other characters there, if they could just meet the people from these other super states that they're constantly at war with, maybe they would realize that these people are actually more similar to themselves than they are different. And there's really no reason for them to be enemies and be constantly at war. And this is a topic that I think is so important even for us nowadays. This is why I love getting to know other cultures, getting to learn other languages, teach other languages, and have that cross-cultural exchange. Because I think when we get exposed to people that have different backgrounds, different beliefs, different life experiences, different cultures than we have, I think there's so much to learn there. And a lot of times what we actually discover is that in so many ways we are actually more similar than we are different. And so that is one of the reasons why I would recommend 1984 by George Orwell and why I love it so much. I would recommend this book in English specifically for you if you're at a C1 level. I think it'll be a good challenge. All right, the next book I want to talk about is Brave New World by Aldous Huxley. This was published in 1932, so actually before 1984. So in some ways, Brave New World could be classified as a utopia, actually, instead of a dystopia. So in 1984, people are controlled through fear and surveillance and propaganda. Well, in Brave New World, it's a little bit different. They've actually created this kind of perfect society where people are always happy and everything seems just like perfect. So instead of people being born as a result of human relationships, they are actually created inside of laboratories, and they're created to fulfill a very specific role in society. And from the time they're created, where they are literally genetically modified to, for example, people for X job are going to have a certain height, and people for this other more fancy job, this government role, they're going to have a taller height. So they actually change them biologically, like they decide on that based on what role they're going to have in society. And then as they are growing up, so from the time they're children, they're growing up like in this laboratory, and they are conditioning them. So they're conditioning some groups of people to have intense fear or trauma about something, and they're conditioning other children to really enjoy something. And so what happens is as these children grow up, they naturally, in air quotes, fit into their role in society. And so it feels like a perfect society because everyone is in exactly the perfect role for them. And then as adults, when they are outside of the laboratory and actually kind of functioning in society, they are discouraged from having monogamous relationships. And so there's kind of these scenes, which is kind of funny, especially when you think about the fact that this book was written in 1932, and so what society would have deemed as normal at the time compared to now, right? But remember, this was written in 1932, and so you have these scenes where there's like women in the book talking, and there's one girl that is like going on dates with some other guy, and she's been going on dates with him multiple times, and the other girl is judging her for like continually going on dates with the same guy, and she's saying like, oh, you need to kind of go out and see many people. You shouldn't have this monogamous relationship or be working towards a monogamous relationship. That's like unhealthy and it's wrong, you know? And people are constantly bombarded with entertainment, but it's not quality entertainment. It is like mindless, superficial entertainment. So they'll go to the movie theaters and just kind of like zone out, and they're not really thinking for themselves at any point. And then whenever somebody starts to feel sad or starts to feel uncomfortable with the situation they're living in, they have this drug called soma, which everybody takes anytime they start to feel a little bit uncomfortable. And then the soma drug makes them feel happy. It kind of makes them zone out. And so they live in this constant state of happiness, but it's not this authentic joy, this authentic happiness. It is just kind of this superficial level. And I think at its heart, this story is really about what it actually means to be human, especially in a world that values comfort over freedom. Now, the author Aldous Huxley, he was born in England and then passed away in California in the States, so he spent time in both countries. And Huxley came from a very prominent intellectual family. His grandfather, actually, Thomas Huxley, was a famous biologist who was kind of known as Darwin's bulldog. Now, remember that this novel was first published in 1932, so this would have been the interwar period between World War I and World War II. And Huxley wrote this novel kind of in response to several things that were happening at the time. Now, one of these things would be a rapid kind of explosion in industrialization and mass production. So for example, we had Henry Ford's assembly line, and you'll see this reflected in the novel actually quite specifically because they measure time in Brave New World, like how we have AD and BC nowadays. Well, they measure time, instead of using AD, BC, they use after Ford. So they'll talk about how many years after Ford. So there's this obsession with kind of mass production. And there were also a lot of advances in science happening at the time, especially in the area of genetics and psychology. And so you can see that reflected in the way that humans are created in laboratories, and there's this kind of genetic engineering that's happening in the story. And so this is also in response to kind of fears surrounding those areas of study. All right, and I want to share with you one of my favorite quotes from this novel. It is, "But I don't want comfort. I want God. I want poetry. I want real danger. I want freedom. I want goodness. I want sin." So this is one of the most important passages in Brave New World, and it's spoken by a character named John the Savage. And as you can maybe guess from this line, he is a character who really rejects this kind of perfect world where comfort is placed above freedom or individuality of any kind. And I think one of the ideas behind this quote is that freedom requires the ability to make the wrong choice. So you see in the quote, John, the character, he says, "I want goodness, I want sin." And I think it's interesting that he has paired those right closely together. But I think the idea is that you can't have goodness if you don't have the option to make the wrong choice, right? And so this character, and I think Huxley through this character, he is really showing how it is important for us to maintain our individuality, our free will, our ability to make choices, even if that means that we'll sometimes make the wrong choice. That's better than living in a world where we are forced to live perfectly. And then in the beginning of the quote, he says, "I want God, I want poetry." And another part of the story that I don't think I mentioned yet is that the government in this society, they completely restrict access to most literature. So they don't have access to Shakespeare's works, for example. They don't have access even to the Bible. However, in 1984, we see them like destroying records and books, etc., newspapers, all of that. Well, in Brave New World, they actually don't destroy it. They just keep it just for themselves. So the world leaders, they have access to this literature and to this kind of important pieces of work that make us think and make us question different ideas, but they don't allow the general public to access it. And so you can see this kind of hypocrisy there where the leaders, they see the value in these texts, specifically when we're talking about literature. There's kind of this scene where it's discovered that they had Shakespeare's works and the Bible and all this kind of the whole time. And so you see this hypocrisy because they clearly believe that it's valuable because they've kept it for themselves, but they don't let the rest of society access these texts. And so the leaders, they understand what society is losing by not having access to this literature. They just believe that this stability and kind of false happiness is worth the price. So really interesting story. I definitely recommend it. I think that's probably my favorite of the three, of 1984, Brave New World, and Fahrenheit 451, which I'm going to talk about in a minute. I think my favorite is actually Brave New World. Really interesting. I would recommend this book if you have a B2, in between like a B2 and C1 level of English. All right, the next story I want to talk about is Fahrenheit 451 by Ray Bradbury. This was originally published in 1953, and in this story, books are completely banned. So our main character, Guy Montag, he is a firefighter, but in this society, the role of firefighters is actually not to put out fires, it's actually to burn books and destroy them because they are banned. And the title of the book, Fahrenheit 451, actually comes from the specific temperature that, according to the story, books burn at. So the temperature that you need as a firefighter to burn the books is 451 degrees Fahrenheit. And so throughout the story, we follow our character Guy Montag as he kind of starts to question what he's doing, right? And this reminds me in some ways of Winston in 1984, because in 1984, Winston was working in the Ministry of Truth and kind of destroying or changing public records, and obviously, manipulating people with that, with those texts. And in this way, we have Guy Montag, who is responsible for burning the books, right? And as he's doing that, he's kind of questioning, like, why is this happening? And there are these scenes where he is, burning books and burning almost the whole building because there's so many books there. And he sees, there's this scene where there's a woman and she's standing there and she's like refusing to get out of the way. And he starts to question himself and he's like, well, what is in these books if someone is, willing to sacrifice themselves for books? Why are these books so important? What could be in there? Because before he was just kind of burning them mindlessly without thinking or questioning, why are we doing this? What could be in those books? And so really interesting to kind of walk through him in this story and kind of go through his process of realizing what he's doing and starting to second guess if what he's doing is right or not. Now, Bradbury places a heavy focus on kind of mass entertainment. So in people's homes, especially in Guy Montag's home, we see that the walls are like covered in, we could think of them as like flat screen TVs or something, but just like the walls are covered in TVs. So there's this constant kind of screen and mindless entertainment that's in front of us, which feels so relevant to today. It's crazy to think that this was written in the 1950s, but nowadays, with social media and the way that we are living our lives, how many of us, are day to day just, how much time do we spend just scrolling through social media and looking at screens? And Ray Bradbury was talking about this and, kind of writing about this in the 1950s, which I think is so interesting. And you see that the result of this kind of constant entertainment is that people really don't want to think deeply anymore. They don't want to have meaningful conversations anymore. They're just kind of satisfied with this mindless entertainment 24/7. And I think what Bradbury is wanting to say with this story is that sometimes something like censorship might happen because people gradually stop wanting to engage with difficult ideas or difficult conversations. And I think it's a nice warning for us nowadays when we are, bombarded with social media all the time and so screens and constant entertainment. I think it's a good reminder for us to take those moments to think about more complex ideas, deal with difficult discussions, and kind of consider those things that are maybe a little bit deeper. The author, Ray Bradbury, is from the States. He was born in Illinois and passed away in California. And remember, this was published in the 1950s. So this was the Cold War era, and there was a lot of fear about nuclear war and political repression. And this is also the time when there was the rise of the television. So televisions were starting to show up in people's houses, which I think we see directly reflected in the story when you have screens all over people's walls. And at the time, this was causing a lot of concern. People were worried about what the effects would be of this kind of constant entertainment, this style of entertainment, and people started reading less because it was getting substituted associated with TV. And so this is clearly a result of that as well. All right, and I want to share with you one of my favorite quotes from Fahrenheit 451. So it says, "And for the first time, I realized that a man was behind each one of the books. A man had to think them up. A man had to take a long time to put them down on paper, and I'd never even thought that thought before." So as I said, throughout the story, we are following our main character, Guy Montag, as he's kind of processing and realizing, why are books important? Why are people, defending books and risking their lives to save books? And he starts to realize, oh, a book is not just a piece of paper. It represents ideas and accumulated human knowledge. So he starts to really kind of understand the value of books. And then just a little bit further down, it says, "It took some man a lifetime maybe to put some of his thoughts down, looking around at the world and life, and then I come along in 2 minutes and boom, it's all over." So here he's talking about how it took, maybe a lifetime to write this book. And I think this comes back to Bradbury's critique of kind of wanting things fast and this kind of quick, easy entertainment, and people's maybe rejection of thinking about difficult ideas, engaging in difficult conversations, reading books that takes longer, writing books, expressing your ideas, which takes longer. And so I think it's connecting back to that theme as well. Now, this book I would say is a good fit for you if you are at the B2 level in English. All right, so today we talked about 3 dystopian novels: 1984 by George Orwell, Brave New World by Aldous Huxley, and Fahrenheit 451 by Ray Bradbury. I'm interested to know if you've read any of these. Share in the comments below. And if you have, or maybe are just familiar with the stories, or maybe just from what I've shared today, I'm curious to know which one of these 3 kind of realities you think most lines up to what we are living in today, or maybe what you expect for the future. So share that in the comments here with me below. And also, don't forget, if you haven't already, to subscribe here to the channel Inglês na Hora. Here we talk a lot about advanced English, so that might be through classic literature recommendations, tips on pronunciation, vocabulary, etc. And if you're interested in studying more with me, there'll be a link here in the caption below. I've got several different courses for those of you that are at the advanced or B2 advanced or proficient level in English, and I specifically have a book club. We go through all 3 of the books that I mentioned today. So 1984, Brave New World, and Fahrenheit 451 are inside of my book club. It's kind of a Netflix style platform where you get access to different courses on classic literature and English, and all 3 of these books are inside one of the courses. So it'll be fun to chat with you on a more in-depth level about these books there as well. So make sure you check out the links here below. All right, thank you so much, and I'll see you in the next video. Bye.